Good morning. Today we pick up with our minor prophets discussions with the book of Nahum. We've already looked at Hosea, Joel, Obadiah, and Habakkuk, and we're now going to look at the minor prophet of Nahum. So before we go there, let me tell you a little bit about a man named Marcion. So Marcion was a second century guy. He was the son of a bishop. He's famous in his own right, but the bad news is he's famous in his own right for being a heretic. Marcion fell into that camp that said he did not want to hear about a God who got angry. He didn't want to hear about a God of wrath. He didn't want to hear about a God of judgment. And so he wanted to take all those passages out of the Bible. And so what eventually happens is that Marcion says there's a God of the Old Testament, and he's mean and he's angry and he's small-minded and he's not who he needs to be. And then there's a God of the New Testament who's a God of love and grace and kindness. And we need to get rid of the God of the Old Testament. We need to focus on the God of the New Testament. So he took out his scissors or whatever you had access to in the second century, and he basically threw away the Old Testament. And then he threw away most of the New Testament, or any part of the New Testament that reminded him of the Old Testament. And that included Matthew, Mark, and John. It included a number of the epistles. And basically it it just included the things that he didn't like. And so he ended up with parts of the Gospel of Luke and 10 of the Apostle Paul's letters. And I share that because there is some Marcionism that is alive today. There are lots of people who tend to think of the God of the Old Testament as being a God who's angry and small-minded and plays favorites with the Jews. And then there's a God of the New Testament who is just much more loving and gracious. And so they don't want to deal with a God who has wrath, a God who is declared to be jealous, a God who talks about judgment. And so they just have problems, among other things, with the book of Nahum. Because in the book of Nahum, more than just about any other book in the Bible, we get introduced to God's wrath. In case you haven't read Nahum in the last, 48 hours, in case you are a closet Marcionite and you just don't read the Old Testament, you focus on the New Testament and the Psalms, I want to read you verses 1 and 2 of what opens as the Oracle of Nineveh, the book of the vision of Nahum the Elkoshite. A jealous and avenging God is the Lord. The Lord is avenging and wrathful. The Lord takes vengeance on his adversaries, and he reserves wrath for his enemies. So Nahum sort of skips the pleasantries. He just goes, he's firing. He didn't get the HR coaching on how to give a performance review, which says, find something to affirm and then talk about a challenge area and then move to an affirmation again. He just comes out swinging and he delivers a very harsh rebuke. So it leaves us with two challenges. One, and that is we're going to have to understand what Nahum is teaching us. We need to understand what Nahum is saying about God's character and God's nature, his jealousy, his vengeance. And then secondly, we have to figure out what we're going to do about what the Bible teaches us. So let me just note, you could be a full-out Marcionite and just say, I think the God of the Old Testament and the New Testament are not the same God, which I think that's wrong. You could be sort of a second-class Marcionite and not ever say that, but just act like that's true and only focus on the New Testament and ignore all of these passages that talk about God's justice and his wrath. Or you could understand a very important point, and that is that it's the parts of the Bible that we don't like that often have the most to teach us, because it's here where we have some cultural blinders on and we don't understand what is really going on. So this week we are going to be looking at the question of God's judgment and wrath and anger, and we're going to be doing so from the book of Nahum. Have a good day.